The call came through at 11:37 on a Tuesday night, just as I was finishing my notes on the Hillsborough poltergeist case. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who introduced herself as Catherine Brenner Walsh, speaking in the careful, measured tones of someone trying to hold themselves together. She needed to see me immediately about her uncle's property in Salem, a taxidermy shop that had been sealed for decades. I pulled my leather investigation notebook across the desk and flipped to a fresh page. After 7 years investigating the paranormal and 13 years working homicide before that, I had learned that the most important details often came through in those first few minutes when clients were still deciding how much truth they could handle sharing. My pen moved across the paper in steady strokes as Catherine explained that her family had inherited Wilhelm Brenner's shop after his disappearance in 1987. The property had remained untouched, locked away by legal complications and family reluctance to deal with what everyone assumed was simply an old man's macabre hobby. Now, with mounting property taxes and pressure from the city, they needed someone to catalogue the inventory before putting the building up for sale. What started as a simple appraisal job had become something else entirely when the first 2 professionals they hired refused to continue working after only a few hours inside. Both cited health concerns related to unusual odors and what one described as a profound sense of unease that made concentration impossible. The third appraiser had lasted an entire day before calling Catherine in a state she described as barely controlled panic, demanding immediate removal from the property and refusing to explain what had frightened him. I set my pen down and reached for the gold pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather. The familiar weight of it in my palm provided a small measure of comfort as I listened to Catherine's voice grow more strained. She had visited the shop herself just once, she admitted, and what she experienced there had convinced her that conventional appraisers were insufficient for the task. The building felt wrong, she said, using that specific word 3 times during our conversation. Not simply old or neglected, but fundamentally wrong in ways she struggled to articulate. The address she provided placed the shop on Commercial Street, in one of Salem's older districts where Victorian-era buildings still dominated the landscape. I knew the area well enough to picture the narrow streets lined with structures that had witnessed more than a century of human activity. These old buildings collected history in their walls, absorbing decades of emotions and experiences that could linger long after the original inhabitants were gone. Some places accumulated enough psychic residue to create genuine disturbances, manifestations that skeptics dismissed, but that my equipment consistently detected. Catherine's description of her uncle matched what I expected from a professional taxidermist of his era. Wilhelm Brenner had operated his business for 35 years, building a reputation that extended throughout the Pacific Northwest. His work adorned hunting lodges, natural history museums, and private collections across multiple states. Neighbors remembered him as a solitary figure who kept odd hours, often working late into the night with lights visible in the shop's basement windows. The chemical odors that occasionally drifted from the building were attributed to the preserving fluids and treatments necessary for his craft. His disappearance had been investigated by Salem police as a potential missing person case, though Catherine admitted the family had always suspected suicide. Wilhelm had been increasingly reclusive in his final months, turning away customers and reportedly spending entire weeks without leaving the shop. When concerned neighbors finally convinced police to conduct a welfare check, they found the building empty but otherwise undisturbed. His tools remained arranged precisely in their designated places. Specimens stood exactly where visitors had last seen them, and no signs of struggle or forced entry could be identified. The case had gone cold within 6 months, officially remaining open but receiving no active investigation. Wilhelm Brenner had simply vanished, leaving behind a building full of preserved animals and a mystery that his family had avoided confronting for 37 years. I agreed to meet Catherine the following morning at the shop, though I made it clear that my initial assessment would determine whether the case warranted my continued involvement. My standard fee for paranormal investigations was higher than conventional appraisal services, but clients who contacted me had usually exhausted normal channels and were prepared for specialized rates. Catherine accepted my terms without negotiation. a response that suggested genuine desperation rather than casual curiosity. After ending the call, I spent 20 minutes reviewing my case notes from similar investigations involving abandoned commercial properties. Buildings where intense emotions or traumatic events had occurred often retained psychic imprints that could manifest as cold spots, unexplained sounds, or overwhelming feelings of dread. My equipment could measure electromagnetic fluctuations, temperature variations, and other environmental anomalies that frequently accompanied genuine paranormal activity. My vintage flashlight sat in its designated position on my desk, the brass fittings polished to a dull gleam from years of handling. The beam had never failed during an investigation, cutting through darkness that sometimes seemed to resist conventional illumination. My compass rested beside it, the needle occasionally showing minor deviations when supernatural forces were present. These tools, combined with careful observation and methodical documentation, had guided me through 267 cases over 7 years. The taxidermy shop represented case number 268, and something in Catherine's voice suggested it would prove more challenging than routine hauntings or residual manifestations. Buildings that drove away multiple professionals often contained more than simple psychic impressions. Sometimes they harbored active presences, entities that reacted with hostility to intrusion or investigation. I closed my notebook and checked the pocket watch one final time before preparing for bed. Tomorrow, I would walk into Wilhelm Brenner's preserved world and determine what had been waiting there for 37 years. The old Victorian building held its secrets carefully, but I had learned patience during my years investigating both human crimes and supernatural mysteries. Whatever haunted that taxidermy shop would eventually reveal itself, and I would be ready to document every detail. The night outside my office window pressed against the glass like something alive, and somewhere across the city, an empty building waited for morning. The morning air carried the scent of rain and decay as I drove through Salem's historic district toward Wilhelm Brenner's taxidermy shop. My vintage flashlight and compass sat secure in my trench coat pockets, their familiar weight a reassuring presence against whatever waited inside that Victorian building. The pocket watch ticked steadily against my chest, its rhythm unchanged by proximity to the location. Catherine had provided an address on Chestnut Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse, where Brenner's disappearance had been officially documented in 1987. The building emerged from morning fog like something from a Gothic novel, its dark wood siding weathered to silver grey and ornate trim painted deep forest green. 2 stories of Victorian architecture rose from a corner lot, with bay windows that reflected nothing but empty sky. A hand-carved sign reading, "Brenner Taxidermy, Est." 1952 hung crooked above the main entrance, secured by chains that had developed an orange patina of rust. The brass door hardware showed similar deterioration, suggesting decades of neglect despite the family's efforts to maintain basic security. Catherine stood waiting near the front steps, a woman in her mid-50s with graying brown hair pulled back severely and wearing a navy wool coat that seemed too formal for the circumstances. Her posture suggested military background or professional discipline, someone accustomed to controlling situations through preparation and attention to detail. She approached my vehicle before I finished parking, her movements brisk and purposeful. "Mr. Holloway, thank you for coming so early. I wanted to complete the initial walkthrough before neighbors became curious about activity here." She extended a gloved hand, her grip firm and brief. "I've brought copies of the original lease documents, my grandfather's business records, and the police reports from his disappearance investigation." I accepted the manila folder she offered, noting the thickness of documentation inside. Most families avoided researching traumatic events involving relatives, preferring to let mysteries remain unsolved rather than risk discovering uncomfortable truths. Catherine's thoroughness suggested either academic temperament or personal investment that extended beyond simple property liquidation. "Has anyone entered the building since your grandfather's disappearance?" I asked, scanning the exterior for signs of forced entry or vandalism. The windows remained intact, their glass obscured by decades of accumulated grime and interior condensation. The police conducted their initial investigation, but found no evidence of foul play or struggle inside. My father visited once in 1989 to retrieve personal effects, but reported feeling extremely uncomfortable and left within 30 minutes. Since then, we've maintained basic utilities and structural integrity through professional services, but no family member has spent significant time inside. Catherine paused, studying my expression carefully. The cleaning company we hired last spring refused to complete their work, claiming equipment malfunctions and an oppressive atmosphere that made concentration impossible. Professional cleaning crews encountered unusual conditions regularly, from hoarding situations to crime scenes requiring specialized handling. Their refusal suggested environmental factors beyond normal unpleasantness, possibly electromagnetic interference that affected their machinery or psychological pressure that created anxiety and disorientation among workers. Catherine produced an oversized brass key, its head decorated with intricate scrollwork that matched the building's Victorian aesthetic. The lock mechanism hasn't been changed since my grandfather's time. He believed in traditional security methods and maintained all original hardware throughout the building. The key turned smoothly despite its age, the lock mechanism engaging with a solid click that echoed in the morning stillness. Catherine pushed the heavy oak door inward, revealing darkness that seemed to absorb available light rather than simply lacking illumination. The air that emerged carried chemical odors, formaldehyde mixed with something organic and unpleasant that suggested decomposition despite decades of abandonment. My pocket watch immediately began ticking faster, its rhythm accelerating from the steady pace it maintained during normal conditions to an irregular staccato that indicated proximity to supernatural activity. The sensation was familiar from previous investigations, though the intensity seemed higher than typical initial readings. Most haunted locations showed gradual increases in paranormal activity as investigators penetrated deeper into affected areas, but Brenner's shop registered immediate response even at the threshold. "We'll need adequate lighting for documentation purposes," I said, removing my vintage flashlight from my coat pocket. The brass casing felt warm against my palm, another indicator of supernatural presence that I'd learned to recognize over years of field work. "I'll conduct the initial assessment alone to establish baseline environmental readings before involving additional personnel." Catherine nodded, stepping back from the entrance. "I'll wait in my car and return in 2 hours unless you need assistance sooner. My cell phone number is written inside the folder with the other documentation." I watched her retreat toward her vehicle before turning my attention to the building's interior. The darkness beyond the threshold seemed to pulse with subtle movement, shadows shifting without visible cause. My compass showed minor needle deviation toward magnetic north-northeast, approximately 15 degrees off true orientation. Temperature readings would require more sophisticated equipment, but the air felt several degrees cooler inside the building than the exterior morning atmosphere. The first step across the threshold brought immediate sensory changes. Sound became muffled, as though the air itself had thickened around my ears. Visual perception sharpened simultaneously, details emerging from the gloom with unusual clarity, despite minimal available light. These contradictory effects suggested active paranormal influence rather than simple environmental factors. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a reception area that had been preserved exactly as Wilhelm Brenner left it 37 years ago. A wooden counter dominated the front space, its surface covered with appointment books, carbon paper forms and brass pen holders arranged in precise rows. Glass display cases lined the walls, containing mounted birds in flight poses and small mammals positioned to suggest natural behaviors. The craftsmanship was exceptional, each specimen showing lifelike detail that made them appear ready to resume movement at any moment. Behind the counter, deeper shadows concealed what appeared to be the main workshop area. My compass needle swung more dramatically as I approached that space, oscillating between northeast and due east in rapid fluctuations that indicated strong electromagnetic disturbance. The pocket watch accelerated further, its ticking now resembling rapid heartbeat rhythm rather than mechanical timepiece measurement. Whatever haunted Wilhelm Brenner's taxidermy shop had been waiting patiently for 37 years, and my presence had awakened its attention. The investigation was beginning, and already I could sense that case number 268 would test every technique I'd learned during my 7 years studying supernatural phenomena. Documentation required immediate priority before proceeding deeper into Wilhelm Brenner's preserved workshop. I withdrew my leather investigation notebook from my trench coat's inner pocket, opening to a fresh page marked Case 268, Salem Taxidermy Investigation, Day 1. The date inscription read November 15, 2024, though something about the shop's interior atmosphere made temporal measurements feel unreliable. My vintage flashlight provided adequate illumination for recording initial observations, its brass casing maintaining that unusual warmth that indicated supernatural presence. The reception area contained evidence of Brenner's methodical approach to his profession. 3 appointment books lay open on the counter surface, their pages yellowed but legible after nearly 4 decades. The most recent entries dated from September 1987, just weeks before Brenner's documented disappearance. Customer names filled appointment slots through October and November of that year, suggesting he maintained regular business operations until the moment he vanished. I photographed these pages with my digital camera, ensuring documentation of potential witness names for follow-up interviews. Carbon paper forms revealed pricing structures that seemed remarkably affordable for the quality of work displayed throughout the reception space. A red fox positioned near the front window showed such lifelike detail that its glass eyes appeared to track my movement across the room. Brenner's technique achieved realism that bordered on the uncanny, creating specimens that retained vitality despite their preserved state. This exceptional skill level aligned with newspaper accounts I'd read describing his reputation among collectors and museums throughout the Pacific Northwest. Glass display cases contained smaller specimens arranged in naturalistic settings, songbirds perched on artificial branches surrounded by dried flowers and painted backdrops depicting forest scenes. Squirrels held acorns in their tiny paws, positioned mid-bite as though interrupted during feeding. Each display demonstrated Brenner's understanding of animal behavior, capturing moments of authentic activity rather than static poses. The preservation quality remained pristine after 37 years, suggesting chemical techniques beyond standard taxidermy practices. My compass continued its erratic behavior as I documented the reception area thoroughly. Needle fluctuations increased when I approached certain displays, particularly a large owl positioned on a high shelf near the workshop entrance. The bird's amber eyes seemed to follow my flashlight beam with predatory intensity, though I attributed this impression to Brenner's skillful eye placement rather than supernatural animation. However, my pocket watch's accelerated ticking suggested otherwise, its rhythm becoming increasingly agitated near specific specimens. The workshop entrance revealed hanging beads that served as a doorway separator, their wooden surfaces carved with intricate animal motifs. Beyond this threshold, my flashlight illuminated workbenches covered with preservation tools, chemical bottles, and partially completed projects. The air carried strong chemical odors despite decades of abandonment, suggesting Brenner's formulas possessed unusual longevity. Formaldehyde dominated the scent profile, but underlying notes suggested compounds I couldn't immediately identify through olfactory analysis alone. 3 workstations occupied the main workshop area, each equipped with different specialized tools. The nearest station contained traditional taxidermy implements: scalpels, forceps, needle nose pliers, and wire forms for internal structure support. Chemical bottles bore faded labels indicating standard preservatives and tanning solutions. This workstation appeared to handle conventional animal preservation projects, the type that sustained Brenner's legitimate business operations throughout his documented career. The second workstation showed more sophisticated equipment. Glass beakers and distillation apparatus suggested chemical experimentation beyond simple preservation techniques. Laboratory notebooks filled multiple shelves, their pages containing formulas written in Brenner's precise handwriting. I photographed several pages, noting chemical compounds that seemed unconventional for taxidermy applications. References to consciousness retention and neural pathway preservation appeared repeatedly throughout his notes, terminology that extended far beyond physical specimen preparation. My investigation methodology demanded systematic documentation before drawing conclusions about these unusual research directions. Historical context would provide essential background for understanding Brenner's work and its potential supernatural implications. The Salem Public Library maintained extensive newspaper archives dating to the early 1900s, resources that could illuminate Brenner's reputation within the community and identify any previous incidents suggesting paranormal activity. Temperature readings showed consistent cooling as I moved deeper into the workshop space. My breath became visible in the flashlight beam, despite moderate exterior weather conditions that shouldn't produce such dramatic internal temperature variations. The building's heating system had been disconnected for decades, but thermal dynamics didn't explain localized cold spots that seemed to intensify around specific work areas. The third workstation occupied a corner position near what appeared to be basement access stairs. This station contained equipment I couldn't readily identify through visual inspection alone. Metal devices resembling medical instruments surrounded a central table equipped with restraining mechanisms. The table surface showed staining patterns that suggested liquid spillage over extended periods, though determining the substance composition would require laboratory analysis. My pocket watch reached fever pitch intensity near this final workstation, its ticking becoming so rapid that individual beats merged into continuous vibration. The compass needle spun wildly, unable to establish any consistent directional reading. These equipment reactions indicated major supernatural presence concentrated in this specific area, likely connected to whatever activities Brenner conducted at this particular workspace. Basement stairs descended into complete darkness, beyond my flashlight's effective range. The wooden steps showed wear patterns suggesting frequent use, with particular concentration on the center portions where repeated foot traffic had created noticeable depressions. Handrail surfaces felt smooth from decades of contact, indicating Brenner accessed his basement workspace regularly throughout his operational period. Professional investigation protocols required establishing baseline environmental conditions before proceeding to secondary locations within the site. I needed historical documentation to understand what legitimate activities Brenner conducted publicly versus any private research that might explain the supernatural phenomena I was already detecting. The Salem Historical Society maintained newspaper archives dating to the 1950s, when Brenner first established his taxidermy business in this Victorian building. My documentation process had consumed 45 minutes of the 2-hour investigation window Catherine had established. Sufficient time remained to conduct archive research at the Salem Public Library before returning for deeper exploration of the basement area. The pocket watch and compass readings suggested whatever haunted this location originated from below ground level, where Brenner likely conducted his most sensitive work away from public observation. I secured my notebook within my trench coat and moved toward the building's exit, maintaining visual contact with the workshop area until reaching the reception space threshold. The specimens seemed more animated now, their glass eyes reflecting my flashlight beam with increased intensity. This heightened activity suggested my presence had awakened dormant supernatural forces that had been waiting patiently since Brenner's disappearance in 1987. The Salem Historical Society occupied a converted brick warehouse 3 blocks from Brenner's taxidermy shop, housing archives dating to the city's founding. Librarian Margaret Chen assisted my research request with professional efficiency, directing me to microfilm collections containing local newspaper coverage from the 1950s through 1980s. The name Chen triggered memories of Sarah, though no relation existed between my deceased partner and this helpful researcher. Professional compartmentalization allowed me to focus on investigation requirements without emotional interference. Brenner's business generated substantial coverage during his 35-year operational period. The Salem Gazette documented his arrival in 1952, describing him as an accomplished taxidermist from Germany who specialized in museum-quality specimens. Initial articles portrayed community enthusiasm for his services, particularly among hunting enthusiasts who appreciated his realistic mounting techniques. Local veterinarians praised his anatomical accuracy and preservation methods that exceeded industry standards. Coverage shifted gradually during the 1960s as neighbours began filing noise complaints about late-night activities at the Victorian building. City Council meeting minutes revealed discussions about chemical odours emanating from Brenner's property, though health inspectors found no code violations during official visits. The taxidermist maintained all required permits and demonstrated compliance with hazardous material handling regulations when authorities conducted investigations. More concerning patterns emerged in 1970s documentation. Missing pet reports increased significantly in Brenner's neighborhood, though police investigations never established direct connections to his business operations. Several residents reported seeing their deceased animals displayed in his workshop windows, though Brenner claimed these specimens arrived through legitimate channels. The city attorney advised complainants that proving ownership of processed remains required substantial evidence beyond visual identification. Criminal investigations began in 1983 when hikers discovered human remains in the Cascade foothills outside Salem. Forensic analysis revealed the body had been subjected to advanced preservation techniques inconsistent with natural decomposition processes. Detective reports noted unusual chemical residues in tissue samples, though laboratory analysis couldn't identify specific compounds used in the preservation procedure. Brenner cooperated fully with questioning, providing documentation for all specimens acquired through legal channels during the investigation period. The final newspaper entry appeared in October 1987, reporting Brenner's sudden disappearance, along with inventory irregularities discovered by his insurance company. Investigators found his workshop undisturbed, but couldn't locate the proprietor anywhere on the premises. His personal vehicle remained parked behind the building, containing luggage packed for extended travel. Bank records showed no unusual financial activity preceding his disappearance, and international authorities found no evidence of border crossings under his identity. Most disturbing was the insurance investigator's preliminary report, published 3 days before the story disappeared entirely from local coverage. The investigator, Thomas Hartwell, described finding specimen storage areas that exceeded building blueprints, suggesting unauthorized construction in basement levels. Hartwell noted preservation equipment that operated beyond standard taxidermy requirements, though he couldn't determine specific modifications without technical expertise. His final statement mentioned anatomical specimens that challenged professional understanding of preservation science before the investigation terminated abruptly. No follow-up articles appeared after Hartwell's report, despite ongoing public interest in the case. The newspaper's editor-in-chief retired unexpectedly 2 weeks later, and subsequent coverage of the Brenner property ceased completely. Property records showed the building remained sealed by court order, though specific legal grounds weren't documented in accessible archives. Research completed, I returned to Brenner's building as afternoon shadows lengthened across Salem's historic district. The Victorian structure appeared more ominous now that I understood its troubled history, particularly the basement modifications that city inspectors had never officially documented. My pocket watch resumed its accelerated ticking immediately upon approaching the property, confirming supernatural activity remained concentrated within these walls. Interior conditions had deteriorated during my absence, though no physical changes were visible to standard observation. The temperature differential between entry areas and workshop spaces had intensified, creating distinct climate zones within the building's layout. Specimens displayed increased animation, their positioning subtly altered from my earlier documentation. Glass eyes tracked my movement with disturbing precision, suggesting awareness beyond preserved animal instincts. Professional protocols demanded systematic basement exploration despite obvious supernatural hazards. The wooden stairs descended into absolute darkness that my vintage flashlight couldn't fully penetrate, though beam reflection revealed substantial space below ground level. Each step produced hollow echoes, suggesting the basement extended considerably beyond the building's foundation footprint, confirming insurance investigator Hartwell's observations about unauthorized construction. Temperature decreased dramatically with each descending step, reaching near freezing conditions by the staircase midpoint. My breath formed visible clouds in the frigid air, though ambient temperature measurements registered normal readings on my equipment. This supernatural cold specifically targeted organic matter, while leaving inanimate objects unaffected, indicating entity presence designed to interact with living tissue. The basement revealed Brenner's true laboratory, containing equipment that exceeded any legitimate taxidermy requirements. Stainless steel tables equipped with drainage systems occupied central positions, surrounded by glass cabinets containing specimens in various preservation stages. Chemical apparatus resembling distillation equipment lined workbench areas, connected through copper tubing to storage tanks containing unidentified fluids. The preservation solutions glowed faintly with phosphorescent properties that suggested non-standard chemical compositions. Most disturbing were the humanoid specimens arranged along the basement's perimeter walls, initially appearing to be anatomical models used for educational purposes. Closer examination revealed preservation quality that suggested these had once been living tissue. The specimens displayed perfect anatomical detail with no visible decomposition, despite decades of storage in uncontrolled environmental conditions. Their positioning suggested they had been arranged with care, almost reverent attention to presentation aesthetics. Documentation photographs captured evidence of Brenner's advanced preservation techniques, though my camera's flash revealed movement within the specimens that shouldn't occur in deceased tissue. Several humanoid forms shifted position slightly when illuminated, their preserved faces showing expressions of awareness that contradicted their obviously deceased status. The preservation process had somehow maintained consciousness within dead tissue, creating a collection of trapped souls unable to achieve natural death. My pocket watch reached critical intensity near the basement's rear wall, where a heavy metal door secured what appeared to be additional storage space. The lock mechanism showed recent use despite Brenner's 37-year absence, suggesting someone or something had accessed this final chamber repeatedly. Professional investigation demanded complete site documentation, though supernatural activity was reaching dangerous levels that threatened my physical safety. Equipment readings indicated massive entity presence concentrated behind that locked door, representing the investigation's primary supernatural epicenter. Whatever Brenner had preserved in that final chamber commanded the building's haunting activity, controlling the animated specimens throughout his former workshop. The preserved consciousness collection served as guardians for something far worse locked away in the basement's deepest area. My investigation had uncovered the truth about Wilhelm Brenner's disappearance and his terrible preservation experiments, but accessing that final chamber would require preparation beyond my current equipment capabilities. The metal door's lock mechanism required specialized tools that I hadn't brought during initial reconnaissance. Returning to my vehicle, I retrieved the lockpicking kit from my investigation bag, along with additional lighting equipment and the digital camera with infrared capability. The supernatural cold emanating from behind that door suggested whatever Brenner had preserved in his final chamber possessed significantly more power than the specimens I'd already documented. My pocket watch maintained its frantic oscillations, the gold case growing increasingly warm against my chest as I approached the locked barrier again. The lock proved more sophisticated than typical residential hardware, requiring nearly 15 minutes of careful manipulation before the mechanism clicked open. The heavy door swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a chamber that defied architectural logic. The space extended far beyond what the building's foundation should accommodate, stretching into darkness that my flashlight beam couldn't fully penetrate. The walls were lined with glass display cases containing specimens that dwarfed anything in the main laboratory. These weren't human remains or animal preparations, but something that transcended both categories entirely. The preservation techniques used in this chamber represented decades of advancement beyond Brenner's earlier work. Each specimen floated in transparent fluid that maintained perfect clarity, despite containing what appeared to be living tissue. The containers varied in size from small jars holding individual organs to massive tanks containing full humanoid forms. None showed any signs of decomposition, their tissue maintaining the pink flush of living flesh despite obvious death. Most disturbing were their eyes, which tracked my movement with awareness that shouldn't exist in deceased matter. Documentation required methodical photography despite the growing supernatural pressure that made each step increasingly difficult. The preserved specimens responded to my presence with subtle movements, their limbs shifting position within the preservation fluid as though attempting to reach toward me. The largest tank contained what had once been Wilhelm Brenner himself, his body perfectly preserved, but altered in ways that suggested extensive experimentation. His face bore expression of triumph mixed with horror, as though he'd achieved his preservation goals while simultaneously realizing their terrible cost. The chamber's rear wall contained Brenner's personal laboratory notes, written in precise handwriting that chronicled his descent into obsession with defeating death itself. The earliest entries described conventional taxidermy techniques, but quickly progressed to experiments with human tissue obtained through unnamed sources. His breakthrough came when he discovered that consciousness could be preserved, along with physical matter, through specific chemical processes that required living subjects. The preservation fluid contained compounds that maintained neural activity indefinitely, trapping awareness within deceased tissue that couldn't achieve natural death. Brenner's final entries revealed his ultimate goal, creating a collection of preserved consciousness that could share knowledge across death itself. He'd convinced himself that his experiments served scientific advancement, preserving human knowledge and experience for future generations. The reality proved far more sinister. The preserved specimens weren't sharing knowledge, but experiencing eternal torment, trapped in dead tissue, while maintaining full awareness of their situation. Their consciousness remained intact, while their bodies became exhibition pieces in his grotesque museum. The investigation revealed that Brenner hadn't disappeared in 1987, as local authorities believed. He'd completed his transformation voluntarily, using his perfected preservation technique on himself to join his collection permanently. The process had succeeded beyond his expectations, maintaining not just his consciousness, but amplifying his ability to control the other specimens. From his preservation tank, he commanded the entire collection, orchestrating the supernatural activity that had plagued the building for decades. The preserved specimens began showing increased agitation as I documented their conditions. The fluid in their containers started bubbling, creating patterns that suggested deliberate communication attempts. My equipment registered electromagnetic fluctuations that exceeded normal paranormal readings, indicating massive psychic energy emanating from the collection. The temperature dropped further, reaching levels that threatened hypothermia despite my heavy coat. Frost formed on every metal surface, while my breath created dense vapor clouds in the supernatural cold. Brenner's preserved form showed the most dramatic response to my presence. His eyes opened within the preservation tank, focusing directly on me with intelligence that defied medical explanation. His mouth moved as though attempting speech, creating air bubbles in the fluid that formed patterns resembling words. The other specimens responded to his movements, their own forms becoming increasingly active within their containers. The supernatural pressure intensified until standing became physically difficult, as though invisible forces pressed against me from multiple directions. The pocket watch reached critical temperature against my chest, its metal case becoming hot enough to burn through my shirt. The compass needle spun wildly, while pointing toward different specimens in sequence, indicating multiple powerful entities operating within the chamber. My flashlight beam began flickering despite fresh batteries, the vintage mechanism responding to electromagnetic interference generated by the preserved consciousness collection. Every piece of equipment registered off-scale readings that suggested paranormal activity beyond anything I'd previously encountered. Professional documentation demanded complete photographic evidence despite the escalating supernatural phenomena. Each camera flash illuminated the specimens more clearly, revealing details that proved their impossible nature. The preserved tissue showed cellular activity that shouldn't exist in dead matter, blood vessels maintaining circulation through unknown mechanisms. Their neural tissue displayed patterns of electrical activity visible through translucent skull sections. Brenner had achieved his goal of preserving consciousness, but created a collection of tortured souls, experiencing eternal imprisonment. The chamber's atmosphere became increasingly oppressive as supernatural activity reached dangerous levels. Objects throughout the space began moving without physical cause, bottles and instruments shifting position while maintaining impossible balance. The preservation tanks showed agitation as their contents responded to forces beyond normal physics. Several smaller specimens attempted to break free from their containers, pressing against glass walls with strength that dead tissue shouldn't possess. My investigation had uncovered the complete truth about Wilhelm Brenner's experiments and the source of the building's supernatural activity. The preserved consciousness collection represented decades of human experimentation that transcended death itself. Each specimen contained a tortured soul, trapped in dead tissue, commanded by Brenner's amplified consciousness to serve his eternal museum. The supernatural phenomena throughout the building originated from their collective psychic energy, channeled through Brenner's controlling influence into manifestations that protected his terrible legacy. The preservation chamber contained evidence of the most advanced paranormal phenomena I'd encountered across 267 cases. Brenner's achievement in maintaining consciousness beyond death represented a scientific breakthrough with horrific applications. His collection served as proof that human awareness could survive physical death when properly preserved, though the process created suffering beyond natural experience. The tortured specimens existed in perpetual limbo, neither truly alive nor permitted natural death, trapped forever in Brenner's grotesque museum of preserved souls. The chamber erupted into chaos as every specimen responded simultaneously to my documentation. Glass containers began fracturing under internal pressure, while preserved tissue pressed against containment walls with increasing desperation. The supernatural activity reached critical intensity that threatened immediate physical harm through electromagnetic interference. My equipment registered readings beyond measurable scales as paranormal energy saturated the underground space. The vintage flashlight beam dimmed to barely functional levels, while casting shifting shadows that moved independently of any light source. Professional instincts demanded immediate evacuation despite incomplete evidence collection, recognizing life-threatening conditions. Brenner's preserved form began moving with deliberate purpose within his central tank, eyes tracking my position, while mouth movements suggested attempted communication. The preservation fluid around him showed violent agitation as his consciousness exerted increasing control over the supernatural phenomena. His presence commanded the entire collection through psychic connections that transcended physical death. The other specimens responded to his mental direction, their movements becoming coordinated rather than random struggles against containment. My investigation had awakened something that should have remained dormant forever. The chamber's atmosphere became toxic as preservation chemicals released vapor through cracked containers. Formaldehyde and unknown compounds created respiratory irritation that forced shallow breathing while supernatural pressure compressed my chest. Each breath brought burning sensation through my throat and lungs, while paranormal activity continued escalating beyond safe exposure levels. The pocket watch reached temperatures that burned skin contact, forcing me to grip it through my shirt fabric to prevent serious injury. Professional documentation required maintaining position despite increasing physical danger. Several smaller specimen containers shattered completely, releasing preservation fluid across laboratory surfaces while their contents began moving with unnatural coordination. Dead tissue shouldn't possess motor function, yet these specimens demonstrated purposeful movement directed by preserved neural activity. Their consciousness remained intact within decomposed bodies, creating abominations that challenged natural law. Brenner's technique had succeeded too well, preserving awareness while trapping souls in deteriorating physical forms that experienced eternal suffering. The larger tanks showed stress fractures, spreading through reinforced glass as their contents increased activity levels beyond structural limits. Preservation fluid leaked onto laboratory floors while creating dangerous chemical hazards that complicated evacuation procedures. The electromagnetic interference affected all electrical equipment, including emergency lighting systems, leaving only my failing flashlight for navigation through increasingly treacherous conditions. Professional protocols demanded immediate retreat when investigation sites became life-threatening environments. Brenner's tank developed multiple fracture points as his preserved form pressed against glass walls with supernatural strength. His eyes maintained constant visual contact, while his mouth formed words that couldn't be heard through preservation fluid. The psychic pressure he generated created physical sensation, like invisible hands gripping my throat and chest. His consciousness had grown stronger through decades of preservation, feeding on the torment of other specimens, while maintaining command over their collective psychic energy. My presence represented the first living witness to his grotesque achievement. The chamber's temperature dropped dramatically as supernatural activity reached peak intensity, creating condensation that obscured vision while making surfaces dangerously slippery. My breath became visible in humid air, while paranormal phenomena generated localized weather effects impossible in enclosed spaces. The preserved specimens showed increased activity as ambient temperature approached their optimal preservation requirements. Dead tissue responded to environmental conditions with cellular behavior that defied medical understanding. Emergency evacuation became necessary when structural damage threatened catastrophic failure of the containment systems. Preservation tanks showed critical stress indicators, while chemical leaks created toxic atmosphere that impaired respiratory function. Professional judgment recognized conditions beyond safe investigation parameters, requiring immediate withdrawal despite incomplete evidence collection. The supernatural phenomena had escalated to levels that posed imminent mortality risk through direct physical harm. My investigation notebook recorded final observations while retreating toward the stairwell entrance. The preserved consciousness collection represented the most significant paranormal discovery across my entire career, proving survival of awareness beyond physical death through scientific preservation techniques. Brenner had achieved immortality through technological methods that created eternal torment for his specimens. Their collective psychic energy generated supernatural phenomena throughout the building, while serving his controlling influence. The evidence documented the existence of trapped souls experiencing perpetual imprisonment in dead tissue. The chamber's lighting systems failed completely as electromagnetic interference reached maximum intensity, leaving only sporadic flashlight illumination for navigation through debris-covered surfaces. Chemical vapors created respiratory distress that demanded rapid evacuation to prevent permanent lung damage. The preservation tanks showed imminent catastrophic failure that would release their contents into an uncontrolled environment. Professional responsibility required preventing public exposure to these supernatural entities, despite the loss of critical evidence. Brenner's tank finally ruptured as I reached the stairwell, releasing preservation fluid and his animated remains onto laboratory surfaces. His consciousness maintained control over supernatural phenomena while directing other specimens toward my position through psychic command. The preserved tissue showed impossible vitality as dead matter moved with purposeful coordination. Professional training provided no preparation for entities that transcended death through scientific preservation methods. Their existence challenged fundamental understanding of mortality and consciousness. The stairwell ascent became increasingly difficult as supernatural pressure created physical resistance against upward movement. Each step required tremendous effort, while paranormal forces attempted to prevent escape from the basement chamber. The pocket watch's extreme temperature indicated massive entity presence throughout the building's lower levels. My equipment registered supernatural activity beyond any previous case experience across 267 investigations. The vintage flashlight provided minimal illumination, while electromagnetic interference affected all electronic systems. Emergency protocols demanded fire department notification despite inability to explain the true nature of basement contents. The supernatural phenomena posed public safety risks that required immediate containment through conventional means. Professional documentation would record equipment malfunction and structural failure without mentioning preserved consciousness or paranormal activity. The investigation officially concluded with recommendations for complete building demolition due to chemical contamination and structural instability. Reaching ground level provided immediate relief from supernatural pressure, while fresh air cleared respiratory irritation from chemical exposure. The building's upper floors showed no evidence of basement activities, maintaining normal atmospheric conditions despite underground chaos. Professional obligation required ensuring public safety while protecting civilians from knowledge of Brenner's true achievements. The preserved consciousness collection would remain secret to prevent scientific interest in replicating his terrible techniques. The investigation revealed Wilhelm Brenner's success in preserving human consciousness beyond death through advanced embalming methods combined with unknown chemical processes. His technique created immortal awareness, trapped in deteriorating physical forms, generating perpetual suffering that powered supernatural phenomena throughout the building. The basement chamber contained evidence of the most advanced paranormal research ever documented, representing breakthrough scientific achievement with horrific applications that challenged fundamental understanding of mortality itself.